The marriage contract was signed before I even knew my brother was dead. I remember standing in my father's study, still wearing my mud-stained traveling clothes from the 3-day ride from London, watching the ink dry on parchment that would chain my life to a woman who had every reason to despise me. My name is Garrett Thornfield, and at 24, I had become the unwilling heir to both my family's estate and my older brother's abandoned promises. The autumn wind rattled the diamond-paned windows of Thornfield Manor as my father, Lord Edmund Thornfield, set down his quill with the finality of a judge delivering sentence. His weathered face, carved by years of disappointment in his younger son, showed no mercy. The candlelight flickered across the family portraits lining the walls, and I could swear my ancestors were watching this moment with the same disapproval that had followed me my entire life. "It is done, Garrett," he said, his voice carrying the weight of aristocratic authority that had governed Yorkshire for generations. "You will marry Miss Lydia Ashworth within the fortnight. The banns have already been read, the arrangements made. Your reckless behavior in London has left us no choice but to salvage what honor remains to our family name." I stared at the contract, my brother's name crossed out in careful script, mine written beneath in my father's precise hand. Thomas had been dead 3 months, killed in a riding accident while I was busy destroying my reputation in the gaming houses of London. The woman he was meant to marry, the woman who would have been my sister-in-law, was now to become my wife. The irony was bitter enough to taste. She agreed to this? I asked, though I already knew the answer. In our world, women had about as much choice in marriage as horses had in being saddled. My father's expression hardened. "Miss Ashworth understands her duty, as you must learn to understand yours. Her family's financial difficulties make this union as necessary for them as your recent disgrace makes it necessary for us. You nearly caused a scandal that would have ruined us all. This marriage will secure both families' futures and perhaps teach you the meaning of responsibility." The weight of what I'd done in London pressed down on me like a stone. The gambling debts, the duel I had barely avoided, the married woman whose husband had threatened to expose our affair unless I disappeared from society entirely. I had fled to Yorkshire like a coward, bringing shame to a family name that had stood unmarked for 3 centuries. Now an innocent woman would pay the price for my failures. When do I meet her? The question felt like asking when I would meet my executioner. "Tomorrow, the Ashworth family will arrive for dinner, and you will conduct yourself with the dignity befitting your station. You will be courteous, respectful, and above all, you will give Miss Ashworth no reason to question this arrangement. Her acceptance is a gift we do not deserve, given the circumstances." That night, I stood at my bedchamber window, watching the bare branches of the oak trees bend before the autumn wind. The same wind that had carried news of Thomas's death to London, where I had been too drunk to comprehend the messenger's words. My older brother, the responsible one, the heir who had done everything right, was gone. And I, the disappointing second son who had spent his life in Thomas's shadow, was now expected to fill his place in every way that mattered. Thomas had been everything our father wanted in a son. Dutiful, honorable, steady as the Yorkshire stone beneath our feet. He had accepted his betrothal to Lydia Ashworth as naturally as he accepted the morning sun, seeing it not as a burden, but as another responsibility to be shouldered with grace. They had met twice, both formal occasions overseen by their families, and Thomas had spoken of her with the respectful affection appropriate to such arrangements. "She has intelligent eyes," he had written in his last letter to me. "I believe we shall suit each other well. She reads Latin and speaks French better than most men of my acquaintance. Her family has fallen on difficult times since her father's death, but there is strength in her that adversity has not broken." Now those intelligent eyes would look upon me instead, and what would they see? Not the steady reliability of Thomas, but the reckless disappointment who had forced this marriage upon her through his own failings. The woman who should have been married to a man worthy of her would, instead, be shackled to his disgraced younger brother. The next evening arrived with the swiftness of an executioner's blade. I dressed in my finest coat, the dark blue wool that had cost me a fortune in London and now seemed like a mockery of the gentleman I pretended to be. My hand shook slightly as I adjusted my cravat, and I wondered if she would notice. Everything about this meeting felt like a performance, and I had never been a talented actor. The Ashworth carriage arrived promptly at 7, the horse's hooves crunching on the gravel drive in rhythm with my racing heartbeat. From my window, I watched a woman in a deep green traveling cloak step down from the carriage, her movements graceful despite what must have been an uncomfortable journey. Even from a distance, I could see the straightness of her spine, the lift of her chin that spoke of pride maintained despite circumstances that would break lesser spirits. Lady Margaret Ashworth, Lydia's mother, was a woman who had clearly known better days. Her once fine clothing showed the careful mending that spoke of genteel poverty, but she carried herself with the dignity of someone who refused to let financial hardship diminish her breeding. She greeted my parents with the practiced courtesy of someone who had learned to navigate society's expectations while harboring private grief. But it was Lydia who commanded my attention completely. When she removed her hood in the entrance hall, I saw what Thomas had meant about her intelligent eyes. They were the color of storm clouds, gray with flecks of green that seemed to shift with her thoughts. Her dark hair was arranged simply but elegantly, and there was something in her bearing that suggested she was taking the measure of everyone around her, including me. Our eyes met across the candlelit hall, and in that moment I saw something that made my chest tighten with an emotion I had not expected. It was not love, not yet, but recognition. She looked at me as if she could see straight through the carefully constructed facade of respectability to the flawed man beneath, and remarkably, there was no revulsion in her gaze. Instead, there was something that might have been curiosity or perhaps resignation touched with the faintest hint of compassion. "Miss Ashworth," I said, offering her a bow that I hoped conveyed more respect than I felt I deserved to offer. "I'm honored to make your acquaintance." She curtsied with perfect grace, her voice steady when she replied, "Mr. Thornfield, the honor is mine." But there was something in the way she said it, a subtle emphasis that suggested she understood the complicated nature of this honor we were both supposed to feel. Dinner that evening was a careful dance of social propriety performed on the edge of a precipice. I found myself seated across from Lydia, close enough to notice the way she held her fork with the unconscious elegance of someone raised to proper manners, yet distant enough that every word between us felt like it carried the weight of our family's expectations. My mother, Lady Catherine Thornfield, maintained the conversation with the skill of someone who had spent decades navigating the treacherous waters of Yorkshire society, but I could see the strain around her eyes. Lady Ashworth spoke of their journey from their estate near Leeds, carefully avoiding any mention of the financial troubles that had necessitated this arrangement. There was dignity in her deflection, a practiced way of steering conversation away from uncomfortable truths while maintaining the fiction that this was simply a pleasant social call between longtime family friends. "Your son Thomas spoke most fondly of Yorkshire when last we met," Lady Ashworth said, her voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone walking on broken glass. "He had such appreciation for the beauty of the countryside." The mention of my brother's name fell into the room like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples of discomfort through everyone present. My father's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, while my mother's smile became more fixed. But it was Lydia's reaction that caught my attention. Her fingers tightened slightly around her wine glass, and for just a moment, something raw and unguarded flickered across her features. Grief, perhaps, or anger, or some complex mixture of both. "Thomas always saw the best in everything," I said, my voice rougher than I intended. It was one of his many admirable qualities. Lydia looked directly at me then, and I was struck again by the intelligence in her storm-gray eyes. "He wrote that he found great peace in these Yorkshire dales," she said quietly. "He believed that the land had a way of healing wounded souls." There was something in the way she said it, a subtle inflection that made me wonder if she was speaking of Thomas's soul or her own. Perhaps both. I realized then that she had lost something in his death too, not love perhaps, but the promise of a settled future with a man she had come to respect. Now she was faced with me instead, the brother who had brought nothing but scandal and obligation to her doorstep. "The land has its own wisdom," I replied, surprising myself with the honesty in my voice. "Though I confess I have not always been wise enough to listen to its counsel." Something shifted in her expression then, a slight softening that might have been understanding. Wisdom often comes at the cost of experience, she said. The question is whether we choose to learn from that experience or repeat our mistakes. The conversation moved on to safer topics. The unusually harsh autumn, the upcoming harvest celebrations, the latest news from London society that my parents carefully edited to avoid any mention of scandal. But throughout the evening, I found myself stealing glances at Lydia, trying to understand the woman who would become my wife in less than 2 weeks. She was not conventionally beautiful in the way that London society prized. Her features were too strong, her gaze too direct, her manner too thoughtful for the fashionable ideal of feminine delicacy. But there was something compelling about her, a quality of presence that drew my attention repeatedly across the dinner table. When she spoke, which was not often, her words carried weight. She listened more than she talked, and I got the impression that she was forming opinions about all of us while revealing very little of herself. After dinner, following the established ritual, the ladies withdrew to the drawing room, while my father and I remained in the dining room with brandy and cigars. The silence stretched between us, heavy with all the things we had never learned to say to each other. "She seems a sensible woman," my father finally observed, swirling his brandy in the crystal glass that had belonged to his father before him. "More sensible than you have shown yourself to be, certainly." The criticism stung, not because it was unfair, but because it was entirely deserved. "I know what you think of me," I said, "what you have always thought of me. But I want you to understand that I take this responsibility seriously. Whatever mistakes I have made, I will not allow them to hurt an innocent woman." My father studied me over his glass, his expression unreadable. "Pretty words, Garrett, but words are all you have ever offered." Thomas understood that duty required action, not intention. "Miss Ashworth deserves better than your promises." The truth of his words hit me like a physical blow. Thomas had always been the son who acted while I merely reacted. When our tenant farmers faced hardship, Thomas had personally overseen relief efforts. When the local church needed repairs, Thomas had organized the fundraising. When our father required assistance with estate matters, Thomas had stepped forward without being asked. And what had I done? I had fled to London at the first opportunity, seeking pleasure and excitement, while my brother shouldered responsibilities that should have been shared. "You are right," I admitted, the words bitter on my tongue. "But Thomas is gone, and I am what remains. I can either continue to fail in his shadow, or I could try to become worthy of the trust you are placing in me. Miss Ashworth deserves a husband who will honor her, and whatever my failings, I intend to be that man." My father's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "See that you are, son. See that you are." When we rejoined the ladies in the drawing room, I found Lydia standing near the tall windows that faced the garden, her silhouette outlined against the dark glass. My mother and Lady Ashworth were engaged in quiet conversation by the fireplace, their voices creating a gentle murmur that provided a backdrop for private words. "The gardens must be beautiful in spring," Lydia said without turning when I approached. Her reflection in the window showed a thoughtful expression, as if she were trying to imagine a future she could not yet see clearly. "Thomas always said they were his favorite part of the estate," I replied, moving to stand beside her. "He had plans to expand the rose garden for—" I stopped, realizing I had been about to say for his wife, and the awkwardness of that truth in our current situation. "For me," Lydia finished quietly. "Yes, he mentioned that in his letters. He thought I would enjoy having a place for quiet contemplation." She turned to face me then, and I was struck by the direct honesty of her gaze. "Mr. Thornfield, I believe we should speak plainly about our situation. We are both being asked to make the best of circumstances neither of us chose. I propose we approach this arrangement with mutual respect and honest communication, rather than pretending sentiments neither of us feels." Her directness was both refreshing and unnerving. In London society, such frank conversation between unmarried persons would have been scandalous. But there was nothing coquettish or manipulative in her manner, only a practical acknowledgement of our shared predicament. "You are remarkably practical, Miss Ashworth," I said, and I meant it as a compliment. "Circumstances have required me to be practical," she replied. My father's death left our family in reduced circumstances, and my mother's health is fragile. This marriage provides security for her and fulfills the obligations your brother undertook before his untimely death. I see no benefit in romantic delusions when practical considerations must govern our choices. Her honesty demanded equal honesty from me. Then you should know that my recent conduct in London was far from exemplary. I have gambling debts, a reputation for reckless behavior, and a tendency toward decisions that prioritize immediate pleasure over long-term consequence. You are getting a poor bargain in exchange for your practical sacrifice. She studied my face for a long moment, and I wondered what she saw there. Whatever it was seemed to neither surprise nor particularly disturb her. At least you're honest about your failings, she said finally. That is more than many men offer. I suspect your brother never told me of his own imperfections, though he surely had them. Perfect men exist only in novels written by women who have never lived with one. There was something almost like humor in her voice, and I felt an unexpected lightness in my chest. You have a remarkably forgiving view of masculine nature, Miss Ashworth. I have a realistic view of human nature, Mr. Thornfield. We are all flawed creatures doing our best to muddle through circumstances largely beyond our control. The question is not whether we will make mistakes, but whether we will learn from them and strive to do better. Her words reminded me of something Thomas might have said, but without his earnest certainty. Where my brother had possessed unshakable faith in duty and honor, Lydia seemed to have developed a more complex understanding of human frailty. It made her both more approachable and more mysterious than the woman Thomas had described in his letters. The following days passed in a blur of wedding preparations that felt more like preparations for a funeral. My mother threw herself into the arrangements with the desperate energy of someone trying to create joy from obligation. Seamstresses arrived daily to fit Lydia for her wedding dress, their needles and pins transforming yards of ivory silk into a garment that would bind her to a future she had not chosen. I found myself watching her during these fittings, amazed by her patience with the endless adjustments and alterations. She stood perfectly still for hours while strangers measured and marked and pinned, her expression serene despite what must have been considerable physical discomfort. When my mother fretted over the smallest details, Lydia offered gentle reassurances that everything would be beautiful, though I wondered if she truly cared about the aesthetic perfection of a ceremony that felt more like a business transaction. The weather grew harsher as the wedding day approached, as if nature itself was reflecting the tension that filled every room of the manor. Cold winds swept down from the moors, rattling windows and sending autumn leaves skittering across the courtyard like fleeing spirits. The servants hurried through their duties with hunched shoulders and worried glances at the darkening sky, muttering among themselves about the ill omens of marrying in such weather. 3 days before the ceremony, a letter arrived that changed everything. I was in the library attempting to read, though my concentration was scattered, when my father entered with an expression I had never seen before. His face was ashen, his hands trembling slightly as he held a piece of parchment bearing an official seal. "Garrett," he said, his voice unusually quiet, "we need to speak privately." Something in his tone made my blood run cold. I followed him to his study, where he carefully closed the door before turning to face me. The fire and the grate cast dancing shadows on his face, making him look older than his 57 years. "This letter comes from Lord Pemberton in London," he began, referring to one of the most influential men in Parliament and a longtime family friend. "It concerns your recent difficulties in the capital." My stomach dropped. I had thought my troubles were behind me, buried in the gaming hells and drawing rooms I had fled. "What does it say?" My father's hands tightened on the letter. "Lord Whitmore is pressing his accusations against you with renewed vigor. He claims to have evidence of your affair with his wife, and he is threatening to publish the details in the scandal sheets unless you return to London immediately to face him in a duel." The room seemed to spin around me. Lord Whitmore's wife, Catherine, had been a moment of madness that I had paid for with sleepless nights and constant guilt. She had sought comfort from a neglectful husband in my arms, and I had been too weak and foolish to turn her away. Now that moment of weakness threatened to destroy not only my own future, but Lydia's as well. If this becomes public, my father continued, his voice heavy with the weight of generations of family honor, it will ruin us completely. The Ashworth family has trusted us with their daughter's future, and we will have betrayed that trust with scandal that will make marriage to you impossible for any respectable woman. I sank into the leather chair across from his desk, my head in my hands. What is Pemberton counsel? He believes Whitmore can be reasoned with, but it will require delicate negotiation and probably significant financial compensation. The man is heavily in debt from his own gambling, and Pemberton thinks a generous settlement might convince him to withdraw his accusations quietly. How much? My father named a sum that made me physically sick. It was more than our estate generated in 2 years, money we simply did not have without selling land that had been in our family for centuries. The irony was not lost on me that my gambling debts would now be paid by sacrificing the very thing I had dishonored the family to obtain. There is another way, my father said quietly. If the marriage does not take place, if Miss Ashworth were to withdraw from the arrangement due to circumstances beyond our control, then the scandal would not touch her family. She could find another husband, one not tainted by association with your mistakes. The suggestion hit me like a physical blow. After days of growing to respect and perhaps even care for Lydia, the thought of losing her felt unexpectedly devastating. But more than that, I realized how selfish it would be to trap her in marriage to a man whose past might destroy her future. She should be told, I said finally. She deserves to know what she would be risking by marrying me. My father nodded grimly. I agree. But Garrett, you must understand that if she chooses to withdraw, I will not blame her. No woman should be asked to sacrifice her reputation for a man's mistakes. That evening, I requested a private audience with Lydia. We met in the small parlor that overlooked the kitchen gardens, a room that had always felt more intimate than the grand reception rooms where our formal conversations had taken place. She arrived wearing a simple dress of deep blue wool, her hair arranged in a style less elaborate than fashion demanded, but which somehow suited her better than the formal arrangements my mother's lady's maid had been creating. You look troubled, Mr. Thornfield, she observed, settling into the chair across from mine with the same direct attention she brought to every interaction. Has something happened? I had rehearsed this conversation a dozen times, but faced with her calm expectation of honesty, all my careful words deserted me. Miss Ashworth, I must tell you something that may change your willingness to proceed with our marriage. My past in London is more complicated than I initially revealed. She folded her hands in her lap and waited, her expression neither alarmed nor particularly surprised. It occurred to me that she might have suspected there was more to my story than I had admitted. There was a woman, I began, the words feeling like stones in my throat. A married woman whose husband is now threatening to expose our affair publicly unless I meet him in a duel. If this becomes known, the scandal will touch everyone associated with me, including you and your family. Lydia was quiet for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the window where the bare branches of an apple tree scraped against the glass in the wind. When she finally spoke, her voice was thoughtful rather than accusatory. What manner of woman was she? Young? Old? Lonely? Calculating? The question surprised me with its lack of moral judgment. Lonely, I think. Her husband is much older, and for what I observed, he treated her more as an ornament than a companion. She sought affection that her marriage did not provide. And you provided it. To my shame, yes. I was drinking too much, gambling too heavily, and I convinced myself that offering comfort to an unhappy woman was an act of kindness rather than betrayal. Lydia turned from the window to look at me directly. Do you love her? The question was so unexpected that I answered without thinking. No, I pitied her, desired her, but I did not love her. What we shared was selfish comfort, not love. She nodded as if my answer had confirmed something she already suspected. Then the question becomes whether you are prepared to face the consequences of your choices, or whether you will continue running from them. Her words stung because they were true. I had been running since the affair began, running from responsibility, from consequence, from the man I was supposed to become. If we proceed with this marriage, you will be running too, I said. running from the scandal that will follow us both. Perhaps, she said, rising from her chair to pace to the fireplace. The flames cast warm light across her face, softening features that had seemed so composed. Or perhaps we will be standing still for the first time in months, choosing to face whatever comes together rather than fleeing separately. I stared at her, amazed by her composure in the face of potential ruin. You would risk your reputation, your family standing, for a marriage that began as obligation? She turned to face me, and I saw something in her expression that I had not noticed before. Not love, certainly, but something that might grow into affection given time and trust. Mr. Thornfield, may I speak with equal frankness? I would prefer nothing else. My father died owing debts that consumed most of our estate. My mother suffers from a weakness of the heart that requires careful management and expensive treatments. Without this marriage, we face destitution within the year. Your scandal, should it become public, would indeed complicate our situation, but destitution is a certainty, whereas scandal is merely a possibility. Her practical assessment of our circumstances was both admirable and heartbreaking. She was choosing security over safety, obligation over escape, and she was doing it with clear eyes and steady hands. There is more you should know, I said, compelled by her honesty to offer complete truth. Lord Whitmore demands either a dual or substantial financial compensation to withdraw his accusations. My father believes the compensation could be arranged, but it would require selling family lands and would leave our estate in significantly reduced circumstances. Reduced but not ruined. Reduced but not ruined, I confirmed. She was quiet for several minutes, staring into the fire as if the flames might offer counsel. When she spoke again, her voice carried a determination that reminded me suddenly of Thomas, though where his determination had been born of certainty, hers seemed born of clear-eyed pragmatism. Then I believe we should proceed with the wedding as planned, she said. Whatever financial difficulties result from resolving your London troubles can be managed with time and care. My mother will have the security she needs, your family's honor will be preserved, and we will have the opportunity to discover whether respect and partnership can grow into something deeper. If you've ever felt trapped by the consequences of your own choices, wondering if you deserve forgiveness from those your mistakes might hurt, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Sometimes the people we think we've failed surprise us with grace we never expected to receive. The wedding day arrived with a crystalline clarity that seemed to mock the complexity of our situation. The Yorkshire countryside was transformed by the first heavy frost of winter, every blade of grass and bare branch outlined in silver. The church bells of St. Michael's rang out across the valley, their bronze voices carrying news of our union to anyone within 5 miles who cared to listen. I stood at the altar in my best coat, the same deep blue wool I had worn to meet Lydia for the first time, now pressed and brushed to perfection by servants who had attended Thornfield weddings for generations. My hands were steady, but my mind raced with doubts that had nothing to do with the woman walking down the aisle toward me, and everything to do with whether I deserved the gift she was offering. Lydia appeared at the church door like a vision from another world. Her wedding dress was simple compared to the elaborate confections favored by London society, but there was an elegance in its clean lines and careful construction that spoke of quality over ostentation. The silk fell in graceful folds from her waist, and the lace at her throat and wrists had been carefully chosen to complement rather than overwhelm. Her dark hair was arranged with orange blossoms that had been forced to bloom in our greenhouse, a touch of spring hope in the depths of winter preparation. But it was her face that captured my attention completely. She walked toward me with her chin raised, her storm-gray eyes fixed on mine with something that looked remarkably like confidence. There was no trembling in her step, no hesitation in her approach. She had made her choice with full knowledge of what it might cost, and she was claiming it with the dignity of someone who understood the difference between surrender and sacrifice. When she reached my side, she looked up at me with a slight smile that seemed to acknowledge the strange nature of our situation while accepting it completely. "Mr. Thornfield," she said quietly, her voice carrying just far enough for me to hear. "Miss Ashworth," I replied, offering her my arm. "Are you ready for this adventure?" Her smile widened slightly. as ready as one can be for any unknown future. The ceremony proceeded with the ancient rhythms that had joined couples for centuries before us and would continue long after we were gone. The words felt both weightier and more strange than I had expected. This formal claiming of responsibility for another person's happiness and well-being. When I promised to love, honor, and cherish her, I meant it with an intensity that surprised me. When she promised to love, honor, and obey me, I heard the quiet strength in her voice that suggested she would interpret obedience in her own practical way. The moment when I kissed her as my wife was both awkward and oddly moving. Her lips were soft and cool, and she did not pull away from the brief contact that sealed our union before God and witnesses. There was nothing passionate in the kiss, but there was acceptance, and perhaps the beginning of affection that might grow into something warmer given time and care. The wedding breakfast at Thornfield Manor was a smaller affair than my parents had originally planned, limited to immediate family and closest neighbors by both the weather and the uncertain circumstances surrounding our union. But what it lacked in grandeur, it made up for in genuine warmth, as if everyone present was determined to celebrate the possibility of happiness, even in the face of practical necessity. I watched Lydia throughout the meal, amazed by her grace in accepting congratulations from people who surely knew this was not a love match. She spoke with my elderly Aunt Margaret about her interest in botany, discussed household management with the neighboring ladies, and even engaged my father in conversation about estate improvements with a knowledge that suggested she had been paying attention to more than just wedding preparations during her visits. But it was during the traditional toast that something shifted between us. When my father raised his glass and spoke of the continuance of family lines and the hope for future happiness, Lydia turned to look at me with an expression I had not seen before. There was warmth in her eyes and something that might have been the beginning of genuine fondness. To partnership in all things, I said when it came time for my toast, looking directly at her, and to the hope that understanding will grow into affection, and affection into lasting happiness. She raised her glass to mine, and when they touched, the crystal rang with a clear note that seemed to promise better things ahead. To partnership, she echoed, and I heard in her voice the same hope I was trying to cultivate in my own heart. The afternoon passed in the blur of social obligations that follow all weddings, but as evening approached, the reality of what came next began to weigh on both our minds. We were married now, legally and spiritually bound, but we were still essentially strangers who had agreed to share a life without sharing love. The wedding night loomed ahead of us like uncharted territory that we would have to navigate with care and patience. When the last guests had departed and the servants had cleared away the remnants of celebration, Lydia and I found ourselves alone in the drawing room, the weight of our new status settling between us like an uninvited guest. The fire had burned low, casting long shadows that seemed to emphasize the distance we still maintained despite our legal union. "I should retire," Lydia said finally, her voice carefully neutral. "It has been a long day." I nodded, understanding that she was giving us both an escape from the awkwardness of our first evening as husband and wife. "Of course. Sleep well, Mrs. Thornfield." She paused at the doorway, and for a moment I thought she might say something more. Instead, she simply nodded and disappeared into the hallway, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the dying embers of what had been our wedding day. The days that followed established a pattern of careful courtesy that gradually began to feel less forced and more natural. Lydia took over the household management with an efficiency that impressed even my mother, bringing order to areas that had been neglected during the months of uncertainty following Thomas's death. She consulted with me on decisions that affected the estate, treating me as a true partner rather than simply the man whose name she now bore. But it was during our evening walks that something deeper began to develop between us. As winter tightened its grip on Yorkshire, we took to strolling through the manor's halls after dinner, talking about everything from books we had read to improvements we might make to the estate when spring arrived. These conversations revealed a mind that complemented my own in unexpected ways. Where I tended toward impulsive enthusiasm, she offered thoughtful consideration. Where she might have been overly cautious, I encouraged bold action. 3 weeks after our wedding, the letter from London arrived that would test everything we had begun to build together. Lord Pemberton's negotiations had succeeded, but at a cost that took my breath away. The financial settlement required to satisfy Lord Whitmore and ensure his silence would indeed require selling a significant portion of our land, reducing the estate by nearly a third. I found Lydia in the morning room, where she had taken to handling the household correspondence. The winter lights streaming through the windows caught the auburn highlights in her dark hair, and I was struck again by how beautiful she was in her quiet, understated way. When I told her about Pemberton's letter, she listened without interruption, her hands still as she absorbed the implications. "How much will remain?" she asked when I finished. "Enough," I said, though the word felt inadequate. "The house, the home farm, the tenant cottages closest to the manor. We will not be wealthy, but we will not be destitute." She was quiet for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the snow-covered garden beyond the window. When she spoke, her voice was steady despite the magnitude of what I had just told her. "Then we will make it enough," she said simply. "Many families manage on less, and with careful planning, we can ensure the estate remains viable for future generations." Her acceptance of our reduced circumstances, offered without complaint or recrimination, moved me more deeply than any declaration of love could have. This woman who had married me as an obligation was now choosing to stand with me through consequence and hardship without being asked. "Lydia," I said, using her given name for the first time since our wedding, "you did not bargain for this level of difficulty when you agreed to marry me." She turned from the window to face me, and I saw something in her expression that made my heart quicken. "Perhaps not," she said, "but I am discovering that some of life's unexpected turns lead to destinations we never knew we wanted to reach." The spring that followed brought changes that transformed both our estate and our marriage in ways I could never have anticipated. The sale of our land was completed with dignity, thanks to Lydia's careful attention to maintaining relationships with our neighbors who had purchased portions of what had been Thornfield property for generations. Rather than treating it as loss, she framed it as an opportunity to strengthen community bonds, and our reduced circumstances became a source of closer connection with families we had previously known only as distant neighbors. But the real transformation was in the relationship growing between Lydia and me. The woman who had married me out of duty revealed herself to be someone I genuinely enjoyed spending time with, someone whose opinions I valued, and whose company I actively sought. She had a way of seeing possibilities where I saw only problems, of finding humor in situations that might have defeated someone with less inner strength. The evening everything changed between us began like so many others. We were walking through the garden as the last light of day faded behind the hills, discussing plans for expanding the kitchen garden to help offset our reduced income. The air was soft with the promise of warmer weather to come, and the first spring flowers were beginning to push through the soil that had been frozen for months. "Garrett," she said, and something in her voice made me stop walking. We stood beside the rose garden that Thomas had planned to expand for her, now simplified but still beautiful in its own way. "I need to tell you something." My heart began to race, but I could not have said why. "What is it?" She turned to face me fully, and in the twilight I could see that her cheeks were flushed with something that might have been nervousness or excitement. "I realize this may seem presumptuous, given the practical nature of our arrangement, but I need you to know that somewhere in these past months, my feelings toward you have changed. I felt as though the world had shifted beneath my feet." "Change how?" "I have come to care for you," she said, her voice soft but steady. "Not as an obligation or a convenient companion, but as a man I genuinely admire and respect. And perhaps," she paused, seeming to gather courage for what came next, "perhaps even love." The words hung in the air between us like a gift I was afraid to accept for fear it might disappear. "Lydia, you don't need to say anything," she said quickly. "I simply needed you to know that this marriage, which began as duty for both of us, has become something precious to me. Whatever you feel or don't feel, I wanted you to understand that I am here by choice now, not obligation." I reached for her hands, marveling at how perfectly they fit in mine. "Then you should know that I fell in love with you weeks ago, but I was afraid to believe that you could ever feel the same way about a man who had brought you nothing but reduced circumstances and social complication. Her smile was radiant in the growing darkness. "Oh, Garrett, don't you understand? You brought me something far more valuable than wealth or status. You brought me a partnership built on honesty and respect, and the chance to build something meaningful with someone who values my mind as much as my presence." When I kissed her this time, it was nothing like the formal acknowledgement we had shared at our wedding. This kiss was born of choice and affection, of months of growing understanding and genuine care for each other's happiness. She kissed me back with warmth that spoke of feelings freely given rather than duty performed. Standing in that garden where my brother had once planned to create beauty for the woman he intended to marry, I realized that sometimes life's greatest gifts come disguised as punishments, and sometimes the people we think we least deserve become the ones we cannot imagine living without. My punishment had been to marry Lydia Ashworth, but my reward was discovering that the woman I had been forced to wed was exactly the woman I would have chosen to love. The years that followed brought their own challenges and joys. We rebuilt the estate's prosperity through careful management and innovative farming techniques that Lydia researched in the agricultural journals she read voraciously. We raised children who grew up understanding that love could emerge from respect, that partnership required both strength and flexibility, and that sometimes the most beautiful gardens are the ones that grow from ground that has been broken and made fertile by hardship. But more than any of these practical successes, we built a love story that proved real affection cannot be arranged or commanded, only cultivated with patience, nurtured with honesty, and allowed to flourish in the light of mutual respect. What began as obligation became choice. What started as duty transformed into devotion. And what seemed like punishment revealed itself to be the greatest blessing of my life. If you've enjoyed this story of finding love in unexpected places, I'd be honored if you'd subscribe to hear more tales of romance, resilience, and the remarkable ways people discover happiness even in the most challenging circumstances. Sometimes the best love stories are the ones that begin with two people simply choosing to be kind to each other and letting that kindness grow into something neither of them dared to hope for.